In the summer of 2005, a Dutch programmer named Patrick Wildenborg changed a single bit in a game file. 1 bit, the smallest possible unit of computer data. A 0 flipped to a 1. The kind of change so small it is almost philosophical. The difference between off and on, between hidden and visible, between a piece of cut content sitting quietly in a game's code and one of the biggest political scandals in the history of the gaming industry. The game was Grand Theft Auto San Andreas. The file was the main game script. The content that single changed bit unlocked was a crudely animated sex scene, a mini-game that Rockstar Games had built, tested, and then deliberately disabled before the game shipped, leaving it buried in the code like a room sealed behind a false wall. The minigame had a name inside the studio. They called it Hot Coffee. Within weeks of Wildenborg posting his modification online, it had been downloaded over 1 million times. Within months, United States senators were standing in front of cameras demanding federal investigations. The game had been pulled from the shelves of Walmart, Target, Best Buy, GameStop, and Blockbuster. The Entertainment Software Rating Board, the organization responsible for rating every major game sold in America, had been forced to re-rate San Andreas from mature to adults only, the harshest rating in the system, a rating that effectively made the game unsellable in mainstream retail. Take-Two Interactive, Rockstar's parent company, was facing a class action lawsuit, an FTC investigation, and a congressional resolution that passed 355 to 21. A lawyer named Jack Thompson was on television every other day calling Grand Theft Auto a murder simulator and a pornography delivery system for children. Senator Hillary Clinton was introducing federal legislation. Australia had banned the original version of the game outright. All of this because one programmer changed 1 bit. This is the story of the hot coffee scandal, the moment a hidden sex scene in a video game triggered a moral panic that reached the United States Senate, permanently changed how games are rated and sold in America, and turned a Florida lawyer into the most hated man in gaming history. To understand hot coffee, you have to understand what Grand Theft Auto San Andreas was in 2004. It was not just a game, it was a cultural event. The Grand Theft Auto series had been controversial since its top-down original in 1997. But it was Grand Theft Auto 3 in 2001 that turned the franchise into something genuinely divisive. A 3-dimensional open world where you could carjack vehicles, hire and kill prostitutes, shoot police officers, and generally enact the kind of mayhem that parent advocacy groups had been warning about since Mortal Kombat in 1992. It was also brilliant, genuinely innovative in ways that influenced almost every open-world game that came after it. Grand Theft Auto Vice City in 2002 expanded the formula. By 2004, the series was the most commercially successful and culturally loaded franchise in gaming. San Andreas was the biggest one yet. Set across a fictionalized version of California, Nevada, and Arizona in the early 1990s, a world modeled on South Central Los Angeles, Las Vegas, and San Francisco, it was 4 times larger than Vice City. It had gang warfare, car customization, a weight and fitness system for the player character, full radio stations with licensed music, and a level of satirical ambition that made it feel less like a game and more like an HBO series that happened to be interactive. It launched on PlayStation 2 in October 2004. In its first 6 months, it sold 12 million copies. It was the best-selling game of 2004. It was the kind of commercial success that made publishers feel untouchable. Rockstar had pushed for mature content throughout development. The studio's creative director Sam Houser had wanted to include sexual content in line with what he described as the game's overall vibe. The idea being that a game set in a satirical version of 1990s Los Angeles that included drug dealing, gang violence, and murder should not pretend that sex didn't exist. He drew the line at explicit nudity and intercourse not for artistic reasons, but for rating reasons. An adults-only rating from the ESRB would have been commercially catastrophic. The game needed to be mature. Mature meant it could be sold everywhere. Adults only meant it effectively could not. So Rockstar built the hot coffee minigame, tested it, and then disabled it. Removed it from the accessible game world, left the code in the files, shipped the game. That decision would cost them everything. Patrick Wildenborg was a modder based in the Netherlands. He was part of the Grand Theft Auto modding community, a large and technically sophisticated group of players who had been hacking into Rockstar's games since the early 2000s, building new missions, new vehicles, new maps, new characters. The modding community was one of the things that had extended the lifespan of the earlier GTA games on PC, and Rockstar had a complicated relationship with it, tolerating mods that added content while being hostile to anything that exposed internal development files. When San Andreas came to PC in June 2005, Wildenborg had already been studying the game files for months. He had found animation files with names that made their purpose obvious. He found code that referenced content that wasn't in the accessible game. He put together what Rockstar had done, built something, disabled it, left it in the files. He released his modification on June 9, 2005, a patch for the game's main script file that re-enabled the disabled content with a single change. He named it Hot Coffee, after the euphemism the game used for the content. In the unmodified game, CJ's girlfriend would invite him in for coffee at the end of a date. The camera would stay outside, suggestive audio would play, and the scene would end. Wildenborg's modification unlocked what happened after the invitation was accepted. The Hot Coffee minigame was crude by any measure. The animations were basic. The character models were partially clothed in most versions of the mod. It was not polished content. It was clearly something that had been built quickly, tested internally, and cut. But it existed. And once Wildenborg released the patch, it was visible to anyone who downloaded it. 1 million people downloaded it in 4 weeks. The gaming press picked up the story almost immediately. At first, it was covered as a curiosity, a funny piece of cut content that modders had excavated from a game's code, the kind of thing that happened in the modding community all the time. But as the story spread beyond gaming forums and into mainstream media, the framing changed. By the time it reached cable news and newspaper front pages, the Hot Coffee minigame was being described as if it were an active feature of the game that any child could stumble across. The distinction between cut content buried in code and a playable feature was lost almost immediately. That distinction would become the central argument of the entire scandal, and it would not matter at all. If the Hot Coffee scandal had a villain, or, depending on your perspective, a protagonist, it was Jack Thompson. Thompson was a Florida attorney who had spent the previous decade making himself the most prominent anti-video game activist in America. His argument was straightforward, and he made it loudly, on television, in courtrooms, in press releases, and in letters to anyone who would read them. Violent video games were murder simulators that trained children to kill. He had linked games to the Columbine massacre. He had tried to sue game publishers over school shootings. He had targeted Doom, Mortal Kombat, and Counter-Strike. He had called the Grand Theft Auto series a series of products designed for the purpose of mentally molesting minors for money. He was not a fringe figure. He was on CNN. He was on Fox News. He testified before state legislatures. He filed lawsuits, sent letters to governors, and made himself impossible to ignore. The gaming community despised him and covered his every move with obsessive detail, which only made him more visible. When Hot Coffee broke, Thompson treated it as the confirmation of everything he had been saying. Here was explicit sexual content hidden in a game rated for 17-year-olds being accessed by children. It did not matter to him, or to the coverage, that the content had been deliberately disabled. It did not matter that accessing it required downloading a third-party modification from a modding website. It did not matter that the game's own rating already restricted it to players over 17. The image was too powerful, sex, hidden in Grand Theft Auto. Thompson went to work. He contacted senators, he contacted the ESRB, he contacted the FTC. He went on every television program that would have him. He called the game a pornography delivery system designed for children. He called Rockstar criminals, he called for criminal prosecution. Senator Hillary Clinton, who had been working on video game regulation issues before Hot Coffee, introduced the Family Entertainment Protection Act, legislation that would fine retailers up to $1,000 for selling mature-rated games to minors. She called San Andreas a stealth pornography game. She urged the FTC to investigate. In mid-July 2005, a congressional resolution passed the House of Representatives 355-21, calling for an investigation into whether Rockstar had deliberately deceived the ESRB to dodge an adults-only rating. Rockstar, meanwhile, had made a critical mistake. When the Hot Coffee story first broke, Rockstar released a statement. The statement said that the explicit content had been created entirely by hackers, that modders had built the minigame themselves, that it was not Rockstar's content, and that the modification violated the game's end-user license agreement. This was not true. It was technically clever. Modders had created the patch that re-enabled the content, and they had technically modified the game file to do so. but the content itself, the animations, the models, the code, all of it was Rockstar's. It had been built by Rockstar's developers, tested by Rockstar internally, and left in the shipped game intentionally or through carelessness. The single changed bit that Wildenborg flipped was not a creation. It was a key that opened a door Rockstar had already built. The lie collapsed almost immediately. A user on PlayStation 2 forums released a tool that enabled the hot coffee content on the console versions of the game. Without any PC modification at all, the content was in the PlayStation 2 code, the content was in the Xbox code. There were no hackers on those platforms. There was no modding community that had inserted anything. The content was simply there, disabled, waiting. Rockstar's statement was exposed as false. The ESRB, which had accepted the mature rating for San Andreas based on a review of the PlayStation 2 version, the exact version that contained hot coffee in its untouched code, announced an investigation. On July 20th, 2005, the ESRB re-rated Grand Theft Auto San Andreas from mature to adults only. Adults only was effectively a commercial death sentence. Every major retailer in America, Walmart, Target, Best Buy, GameStop, Blockbuster, Circuit City, Sears, immediately pulled the game from their shelves. Some announced they would not carry it even after a clean version was released. Australia revoked the game's classification entirely, making it illegal to sell in the country. Rockstar halted production of all existing copies of the game. They announced a mandatory recall. They began developing a new version, San Andreas 2.0, with all hot coffee content physically removed from the code, not just disabled. Take-Two's stock fell. The company revised its financial guidance downward. The fiscal quarter that included the re-rating saw Take-Two report a loss of $28.8 million, double the loss from the same quarter the previous year. The total financial damage from the scandal, including lost sales, recall costs, and eventual legal settlements, has been estimated at over $50 million. The legal machinery that followed the re-rating ground on for years. The FTC investigated Take-Two for deceptive marketing practices. Their conclusion, reached in 2006, was that Take-Two had been deceptive in how it marketed San Andreas, but they did not impose a fine. They did issue a warning. If Take-Two violated rating standards again, each violation would carry a civil penalty of up to $11,000. Class action lawsuits were filed in multiple jurisdictions. Players who had purchased San Andreas before the re-rating claimed they had been deceived into buying a product that had been misrepresented. The consumer class action settled for between $1 and $2.75 million, a separate securities class action, alleging that the hot coffee scandal had caused Take-Two's stock to fall artificially, settled in 2009 for $20 million, of which Take-Two paid approximately $5 million from its own funds. Of the 12 million people who had purchased San Andreas before the re-rating, 2,676 actually returned the game for a refund. The attorneys who brought the consumer class action described this number as disappointing. It was also, depending on your perspective, the most honest data point in the entire scandal, a signal that consumers who actually owned the game were largely unbothered by its contents. Jack Thompson continued, he filed lawsuits against other games. He targeted Bully, another Rockstar release, trying to have it banned as a public nuisance in Florida. A judge ruled against him, but only after requiring Rockstar to produce the game for the judge's personal review before it could be released. One of the stranger moments in the history of game regulation. Thompson sent letters, he appeared on television, he accused his opponents of crimes, he submitted over 100 pages of gay pornography to a judge as part of a filing, an act that contributed to the bar complaint proceedings that would eventually end his career. In 2008, the Florida Supreme Court permanently disbarred Jack Thompson. He had been found guilty of 27 violations of professional conduct rules, including making false statements to courts, disparaging other lawyers, and a pattern of behavior that the court described as conduct prejudicial to the administration of justice. He appealed to the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court declined to hear his case. Thompson later said the 3 years after his disbarment were the hardest of his life. He described depression, isolation, and a sense of complete loss. He eventually found work as a civics teacher at a Florida prison. He told an interviewer it was the best thing he had ever done. The hot coffee scandal changed things, not all of them in the ways the people driving the scandal had intended. The ESRB was shaken. The rating board that had processed San Andreas for its mature rating, accepting the game's own submission without independently verifying the content of the code, now understood that a game's submitted content and a game's actual content were not necessarily the same thing. The ESRB updated its submission requirements. Publishers were now required to disclose not just playable content, but any content in the game files that could be unlocked, even disabled content, even cut content, even content that required a third-party tool to access. The bar for disclosure moved. The ratings system itself was reviewed and tightened. The scandal prompted the ESRB to scrutinize other games. The Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion was re-rated from teen to mature after the ESRB found graphically violent content and a nude texture that modders had already been accessing for months. Games that had been submitted and rated under the old standards were now being reconsidered under the new ones. Hillary Clinton's Family Entertainment Protection Act never passed into law. The broader push for federal video game regulation that the hot coffee scandal was supposed to trigger did not materialize. Courts had been consistently ruling that video game content was protected speech under the First Amendment, and those rulings continued. A 2011 Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association, definitively ruled that video games were a form of protected artistic expression and that government restrictions on their sale to minors were unconstitutional. The gaming industry had, in the end, defended itself, not because its products were without edge or provocation, but because the law protected what Rockstar had made just as clearly as it protected films or books or music. The moral panic had produced investigations, lawsuits, congressional resolutions, and a great deal of television airtime. It had not produced lasting legislation. There is a number that sits at the center of this story and keeps returning to it. 2,676. That is the number of people, out of 12 million, who actually returned Grand Theft Auto San Andreas when given the opportunity. 12 million people had bought the game. Senators had stood in front of cameras calling it a pornography delivery system for children. Retailers had pulled it from shelves. Congress had voted 355 to 21 to investigate whether Rockstar had committed fraud. Australia had banned it. And when the dust settled and consumers were offered a full refund, 2,676 of 12 million took it. That number tells you something about the gap between how games were talked about in 2005 and how they were actually experienced by the people who played them. The politicians and advocates who drove the hot coffee scandal were not talking to the people who owned San Andreas. They were talking past them, to a television audience, to a voter base, to a cultural anxiety about what children were consuming that had more to do with the symbol of Grand Theft Auto than with the reality of anyone's actual experience of playing it. Jack Thompson is now a civics teacher in a Florida prison. Hillary Clinton's gaming legislation never became law. The ESRB's ratings are still voluntary. Grand Theft Auto is still the most commercially successful entertainment franchise in history. Grand Theft Auto 5, released in 2013, has sold over 200 million copies, more than any other entertainment product in history except Minecraft. Rockstar is still making games. Take-Two is still one of the largest publishers in the industry. The hot coffee scandal did change things. Ratings submission requirements are stricter. Publishers think harder about what they leave in their code. The conversation about what games contain and who should be allowed to buy them is more sophisticated than it was in 2005. But the fundamental question at the heart of all of it, whether the government should decide what adults can see in interactive entertainment, was answered definitively by the Supreme Court in 2011. The answer was no. The answer had always been no. It just took a hidden sex scene in a Grand Theft Auto game, one changed bit, and 4 years of congressional hearings to confirm it. Patrick Wildenborg, the Dutch programmer who started all of this, later removed the original hot coffee download link from the internet as a gesture of support toward Rockstar during the worst of the scandal. The mod had already spread too far to matter. It is still available today on dozens of sites, downloaded by people who mostly want to see what all the fuss was about. The answer usually is that it wasn't much to look at. It never really was. The fuss was never about the content. The fuss was about what the content represented. A symbol, a flashpoint, a single changed bit that somehow became a national conversation about who gets to decide what we play. 1 0 flipped to a 1, the smallest possible change. It was enough.